Hello everyone, welcome to this session, the pesticides perception, what consumers do, don't and should know about pesticides. I hope you're all enjoying a bit of lunch and hopefully this will be an enjoyable session where you might learn a few things and yeah, just sit back and hear some insight. So my name's Nina Pullman, I'm your chair for today. I'm the editor of Wicked Leaks, which is the magazine published by Riverford on sustainable food and ethical business. And we've got two brilliant speakers for you today. We've got Anna Turns, who's an environmental journalist and author of a new book, Go Toxic Free, Easy and Sustainable Ways to Reduce Chemical Pollution. And Sarah Haynes, who's the collaboration coordinator at the Pesticide Action Network and also runs the Pesticide Collaboration. So it's really great to see this topic being widely discussed at the conference this week. I've noticed a few other sessions on the same issue, focusing on things like worker rights and safety, farmers. There's a session on policy as well. So we really wanted this session to be around, what do consumers know? What should we be asking? Some of the common misconceptions and questions that people might have around pesticides and other chemicals in our life. And obviously there's, two main crises at the moment, with the nature collapse, there's the climate crises, really thinking about species decline and the effect on insects and wildlife. And then there's the human health element as well. So it really affects our lives and the world around us in many ways. So really, really topical and important topic. So we'll kick off with Anna, who can just give us a bit of background about her book, the research that she did, some really interesting personal investigations, and I'll hand over to her to tell us a bit more about what she found.
Thanks, Nina. Hi, everyone. So yes, I've been down lots of rabbit holes with my investigations for my book, and one of the things I have done is I had my blood tested actually for persistent organic pollutants, and some of which are pesticides. And it really hit home to me that these things are literally everywhere and they last generations. So one of the things that came up in my blood was DDE, which is a metabolite of DDT, which was obviously banned decades ago. And I've still got tiny bits of that in me, although I was not around when it was being used. But one of the most surprising things that was at relatively high levels, or surprisingly high levels anyway, according to the scientists, was a pesticide called chlordane, which was banned in 1981. I was born in 1980, so it was probably passed down to me through the womb, basically. And it's got such a long half-life that it's still in me, age 41, and it's probably in my children. And that really, for me, was a bit of a wake-up call moment to think that even though pesticides can be banned, hazardous ones can be banned, it still takes generations to really sort out the levels of them and reduce those impacts in us and in the planet, which is why it's so critical that we really think about the regulations of them. But obviously, all of this is really, really complicated. And for consumers, for my book, I'm coming at it from very much a kind of general public perspective. And for consumers, there is just so much information that is hard to understand. We don't necessarily understand specific names of pesticides and which ones are bad and which ones are okay, and if we should ignore all of them, or like it's quite overwhelmingly complicated, really. So really what I wanted to think about was how to distill that into really simple actions and really kind of simple ways to reduce our exposure, but also voice our concerns and call out those things. And really the biggest thing we can do is kind of call for better regulation, because the sooner we do that, the sooner we can start having those impacts and banning those chemicals and reducing the levels in our blood and in the soil, in the environment. It's all around us, really. It's kind of in the air, it's everywhere. But yeah, that was the main take home for me when I had those blood tests. It was a real serious wake-up call. And I also made a radio program for Radio 4 Costing the Earth called My Toxic Cocktail, which was kind of linked into the blood test, but also looking around my house and in each room, and the fact that, and this is something we'll cover in further discussion in a minute, but pesticides aren't just on the food we eat. They're in every room of our house in different ways. So they might be in the bedding that we're sleeping on and spending a third of our lives on, for example. or they might be in the garden shed, and lots of different points of contact with them. So it's not as simple as thinking, okay, I'm just going to buy organic fruit. It's embedded in lots of different parts of our lives, and I think it's that aspect that it's really important to raise awareness of that, and to enable consumers to make better decisions, but make that information clearer. And it's a really complicated thing to do because there is so much information. So that's something we'll hopefully discuss in a moment.
Yeah, brilliant. And just a really quick addition, Anna, did you get any sort of feedback or insight? You know, obviously pesticides are bad, but in terms of, you know, the harm that they can do, just to kind of clarify why, you know, we shouldn't all be terrified we've all got pesticides inside us, but then again, obviously there is some real risk to human health from some of these chemicals. And what are some of those risks, just that we, you know, we kind of set the scene a little bit in terms of why we need to even be worried about this from a human health point of view?
Of course. I mean, the scientist that I had the tests done by, and who kind of spoke to me on the documentary, he didn't want me to panic. He said, it's fine. I mean, we basically all got a toxic load within our bodies. We've all got different chemicals, and that will be different between all of us in different situations, different locations, different stages of our lives, all of those kind of things. But he really looks at population trends. So the whole point about health harm is it's not necessarily a very acute thing. It might be a kind of lifetime exposure thing. It might be that if you're working with pesticides, for example, the impact might be much more distinct, much more obvious. But a lot of these pesticides are endocrine disruptors, which are basically they kind of mess with the hormones in our bodies. So they can impact thyroid function, for example, or they can affect fertility. Some affect brain development. It depends. If, for example, if you're a pregnant woman, it could impact your developing baby and have an impact on that. And long-term exposure has been linked to certain cancers, such as leukemia, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It has been associated with asthma, depression, ADHD, lots of different things. So it's quite a complicated picture. It's not a kind of simple, this causes this, but it might make you more likely to experience certain diseases.
Yeah, and I think that point about complexity is really interesting, because that's partly why, you know, they are permitted. It is difficult to pin down exactly what the effect is. They build up in your body over such a long period of time, and, you know, that is potentially why, you know, A, it's hard to really work out what's going on, and B, why they are still kind of allowed, if I'm right in thinking, Sarah. And if I bring you in at this point, could you perhaps just explain for a general public audience, I'm sure there'll be a mixture of people in this audience, but, you know, how does regulation work for pesticides? Just briefly, like how are we still allowed to use these chemicals? I mean, how are they sort of regulated in the UK as far as you understand it?
Yeah, and I have been working on pesticide stuff for kind of past year or so, and I'm not an expert, but Nick Mole, who I think is in the session, is our resident expert. Pan UK is a small organisation of kind of scientists and campaigners. We're the only UK organisation focused on reducing kind of pesticide related harms, like solely. But yeah, in terms of regulation, it is really interesting because it's a very, very narrow scope through which pesticide actives are tested and are regulated. So, you know, there's an interesting study even late November that showed it's not, you know, pesticides are regulated by their active substance. They're not even regulated in terms of the formula that they end up in the bottle or in the container that's then sprayed and used. So, you know, a good example was there was a study last November or October came out by a PhD student that showed that the co-formulants, the other things in the mixture, actually mixed with the active pesticide substance and made it way more toxic to bees, for example. And yeah, we regulate pesticide by pesticide. We don't regulate around, you know, how they mix together or how, you know, one pesticide might be sprayed, another pesticide might be sprayed, and how they interact in the real world. So, you know, one of the things that I know we were going to talk about was the cocktail effect, and how, in kind of that regulation and how blinkered and skewed it is to such a narrow scope, kind of tips the scales in the balance of agrochem companies to say, you know, let's look very narrowly at this and what this harm is. And it's really hard to follow that across like the multiple uses and across time in terms of chronic accumulation in the environment and in our bodies. So yeah, the cocktail effect, there's a really good study that was put together by Pan UK and Soil Association, looking at those interactions and the multiple pesticides found on different foods, and how they all interact together. But it's really hard. No one's had no one can come up with a real world methodology to nail it down and quote unquote,
I suppose there's not much
it.
interest in doing that, is there, for some companies? If they were to turn that into a formal way of regulating it, probably wouldn't turn out too well for
and there's
companies.
So many variables in there that it would be hard to kind of quote unquote prove it one way, like very, very definitively. But there are certainly trends, like Anna's pointed to, around usage of certain pesticides, where pesticides are used, and kind of chronic health issues. There's definitely links between Paraquat, for example, and Parkinson's disease, the way that they interact with our health and gut system, and how that interacts with our neurological systems. There's there's a growing body of evidence around that, for sure.
And we'll come on to the supermarket ranking in just a sec, because I know that's such a great piece of work that you guys have done recently. But just for the average person, and just could you explain how you mentioned Paraquat, which I believe is banned in the UK, but is still used elsewhere. We obviously import food from elsewhere. So what's the deal with importing food? Is it possible to buy and eat food in the UK which has still got residues of these banned chemicals on? And what are maximum residue levels actually any good?
So there's a maximum residue level. So the UK government has a set residue level that's a maximum that it will accept on produce coming in, but they do only test around 3,000 kilos of food, and it comes out into a report that you can look at, and it's actually that report that we pull the dirty dozen and the clean 15 from, in terms of how we package it up. It's from those residue levels. The other concern is around these incoming trade deals, in terms of how the standards are very different. So for example, on an Australian grape, you can use 6,000 times more of a certain fungicide than is allowed on those maximum residue levels in the UK. And what is that going to look like for the pressure to lower UK standards in this kind of post-Brexit world, which is partly why a number of organisations have come around to pull together around the pesticide collaboration in this very specific post-Brexit period, where there's a lot of pressure on regulation, and the UK is coming up with its own regime and things.
Yeah, it's a time of great change, isn't it? And a lot of people jumping in to try and do things their way. So tell us a little bit about the supermarket ranking that you did recently. So that was a really interesting report. What were you looking at there, and what did you find?
Yeah, so supermarket ranking system is kind of a long-running campaign for Pan UK, and it's working with the kind of top 10 most shopped at supermarkets in the UK across 8 different categories, and really looking at residue data, gardening products, transparency, how they support their suppliers to transition off pesticides and maybe use other methods. And it goes into like a lot of detail. The most recent ranking came out in November, and you can kind of access that on Pan UK's website. But there's a lot of kind of positive movement over the past 2 years. For example, Co-op and Waitrose have stopped selling pesticide gardening products in their stores as a result. But a lot of the really interesting work actually goes on in between the rankings, in terms of chatting with those 10 supermarkets and people that have influence on supply chains, and talking to them about, what would get them further up the ranking next time. So looking at the transparency around, you know, what is their pesticide policy? Do they have that on their website so that consumers can have a look and make informed choices? What does their highly hazardous pesticide list look like? How are they transitioning the use of certain highly hazardous pesticides in their global supply chains? Because the buying and purchasing power of UK supermarkets is not just contained obviously to the UK, it's really far reaching to growers and workers in other countries. You know, example is South African citrus does have really high levels of paraquat involved in its production, and what that means for the workers that are exposed to that in the growing of those kind of that produce. And then yeah, looking at how supermarkets can help consumers and buyers around, you know, the residue data and different things. But yeah, there's kind of 8 categories, and it goes into a lot of detail on the website and things.
It's a great report. I really recommend. We might be able to put a link in this chat actually. On that note, I would just say that so we've got 2 functions in this session: the chat and the Q&A. If you have any questions, if you put them in the Q&A channel, and what I'll do is pick out some questions as we go along from there. The chat gets really nice and lively, but if you've got specific questions, you put them in the Q&A, and we will endeavour to answer them. So I was interested, Anna, and also Sarah, so you've mentioned obviously citrus from South Africa, paraquat. There's lots of these chemicals that are banned here. We wouldn't necessarily want to be consuming. Is it just as simple, like, what do you think about the idea of labelling? Like at the moment, organic food is labelled, and non-organic food, which is, you know, 99% likely to have been produced with pesticides, even if it's an animal, the grain that the animal has fed is probably grown. I mean, it is definitely grown with some kind of chemical, because if it wasn't, they would damn well put the organic label on there because they can sell it for more. So you can just assume that if something isn't organic, it's been produced most likely, unless it's a tiny little local supply chain, it's been produced with chemicals. So do you guys think that that would be a good solution, to switch the labeling round? Do you know of any examples in the world where labeling is being looked at? Anna, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes so much sense. I think it's very skewed that organic certifications are labelled and the rest aren't, if that makes sense. So if organic certifications were ditched completely, but all non-organic food had to be labelled contains pesticides, I think that would really focus the mind of people when they're buying things, because they'll suddenly go, oh, okay, I'm going to buy something that's maybe a little bit more expensive, but I'm going to waste none of it and be really kind of see it as a really precious resource, or seek out something organic that is made locally, seasonally, and there's more of it. And also I think the balance is wrong. Like we think of organic as kind of special and different, and actually it should be normal and accessible to everybody. And even the United Nations stated in a report that food that is contaminated by pesticides cannot be considered adequate food. So it is not fair. There's a massive inequity. But for my book, I started looking into the kind of the possibility of labeling this and making this a lot clearer. And again, it comes back to the fact that it's so multi-layered, it's so complicated. You look at a label on an apple or a satsuma, for example, there's no space. Like, you just couldn't possibly list the pesticides on there. And even if you were to potentially list the pesticides on a website, they are from different growers, they're from different countries, different pesticides are used at different times of the year. It's not a kind of static, simple summary. It's a really, really complicated thing. So although I would love to see better labeling, I don't think it's as simple as saying we've got to list all the pesticides that have been used on this item in here, because it's a moving beast. It's just, it's not a static thing.
Yeah.
And I think the solution really is way back. It comes back to that rigorous regulation, that we want to get to the point where we're not using any of the highly hazardous ones, that the ones that are used, we reduce to the kind of minimum level that we can do, and that we just eliminate the really bad stuff. Because like you've already mentioned, they travel around the world, and we end up eating imported foods that have got banned highly hazardous pesticides on them. and it's going to come back to bite us unless the regulation is really comprehensive and global. There are always going to be loopholes in terms of where it can be produced or where it can be transported to or used, and all of those things.
Yeah, I was also thinking as well, I think at this point it's worth remembering, like, so on the other end of this is the farmers who are using the chemicals, that and just kind of thinking about their situation, because they're not you know, they're not evil poisoners of the world.
No, of course not.
And the situation is very low margin, like it's, you know, it's hardly any money, especially in fruit and veg. You take any risk out of it that you can. And the truth is that chemicals give control, and that is really important for farmers who are making not much money. That's not where the money is in the food supply chain. It's in the middle, it's with the supermarkets. The producers, they're doing everything they can to not lose their whole crop. So if we remember that when we're thinking about solutions, we also need to think about how it's got to be a massive part of the conversation, hasn't it, around getting farmers. And there's loads of really good examples of that happening, you know, organic, obviously, but there's actually lots of research going on to share organic practice with non-organic farmers. And there's things like predatory insects, and there's ways of producing food without chemicals. But I suppose there's also, like, you know, a food waste issue there. We've got to have shorter supply chains, so there's less waste. But I think just remembering that, like, the chemical side, it is, and I've heard recently from 2 farmers actually kind of really showed that as an example. There was one who is an organic farmer, and she has lost, I think, about 15 grand worth of broad beans because of a pest attack, and that's just gone, and she wasn't able to use any chemical control, and she's not going to get that money back. So that's a big loss to her. She's invested in organic farming. That's, you know, that's the thing. And then on the other hand, a farmer who I spoke to recently who's converting from non-organic arable, where he was lots of herbicides, lots of chemicals, to organic, and he is having the conversation with his father at the moment, and it's really scary for them, because they're going to lose, to start with, 2/3 of their yields. They just know that straight away. So it's a really difficult thing to expect farmers to do, and I think that's where the report around the supermarkets is really great, because they need to know that they're going to be supported to do that, and you know,
and
if
take
consumers,
that risk out, because it is so scary. Kind of make that transition easier, and for them to know that there is a market and there is consumer demand for pesticide-free food and all of those kind of things. But also enabling them to take that leap. And I suppose also having the proof that it's going to be okay, that you will still have the yields and things. And that comes back to something we've discussed in the past, the evidence-based, the farm-led research by Soil Association do research with innovative farmers, and they have trials, so they're quantifying these new ways of farming, so that farmers can see the proof of how different ways can be compared, I suppose. But it's lots of different pieces of a puzzle, isn't it, that they all need to happen at once to make it viable.
Definitely. And I think, you know, it's really important to remember, like, we're consumers, we're in the world. If you let your kind of, if you care about something, you let people know, you know, let supermarkets know, then that's a really good strong lever for change. And I wondered if we could sort of go on to sort of where else in people's general lives might they be exposed to chemicals or pesticides or other pollutants that we might not have thought of. And yeah, if there's a link there with sort of the same sort of issues. Are there any other places that we haven't touched on, sort of in the home, outside, like rural environments? Sarah, perhaps you want to start with that one.
I mean, I know that the Women's Environment Network have been looking at pesticide residues in, like, menstrual products, so in tampons, in
really,
in the fibers that are used there. I think, before we kind of officially started this, we were also chatting about there was a study in Belgium looking at pesticide residues in children's bedrooms and the drift from spray and things in rural areas. And I can't remember the exact stat, but there's like in the tens of pesticide residues found in children's bedrooms, and they're obviously crawling around, and kids, especially small babies, love to stick everything in their mouth. And they're also the category, along with pregnant women and others, that are more vulnerable to the effects of pesticides and how it interacts with their systems. And then, you know, I think there was a kind of very conscious shift at a point with Pan UK to decide to not focus too much on banging our heads against the wall with central government, but instead looking more at pesticide-free towns and going council by council. And that's been really successful over the past couple of years. Increasingly, you know, bunches of small campaigners going around and campaigning for their town and areas like playgrounds, around hospitals, schools, etc., for councils to go pesticide free and look at non-chemical alternatives, because it's totally possible. And there's other countries, like in France, they don't use pesticides in local authorities anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. And I'm just popping into the Q&A because I've seen a question that links to that, which is, are there any examples in the world, or, you know, anywhere that on the planet that we could use as a sort of control which is clean from pesticides? And I know, Anna, you've done a bit of research and looked at these. Do you know of any examples of countries or places in the world or states that are doing things differently?
In terms of farming with pesticides, there's a couple of places. So Bhutan in the Himalayas, Cuba, and there's one state in India called Sikkim, which is pesticide free and totally organic. But I would also say that pesticides, it's not just through food, as Sarah said. It's also in all the textiles in our homes as well. So things like the curtains and the sofas and the bedding that we've got, or any kind of non-organic cotton will have pesticide residue in it. Obviously, the older things are, the less they will have in them. So buying secondhand is actually a really good thing, because it will have fewer chemicals in them.
Is that just because fewer were used at that time?
Or because they've been washed out?
Yeah.
But also thinking, one thing I kind of thought quite hard about when I was writing the book is that often people think of the most toxic room in your home as potentially the kitchen, for example, because there's lots happening in there. But actually, the one we spend the most time in is the bedroom. We spend a third of our lives in the bedroom, and we're asleep between our bed sheets. And actually, if they are brand new, non-organic, they will have pesticide residues on them, and they'll be off-gassing, and we'll be breathing them in. And so I'm not saying we're all going to kind of inhale high volumes of things straight away as soon as we go to bed tonight, but it's just that extra added layer of exposure that if we have a choice to maybe kind of buy one set of organic cotton bed sheets, if we can afford it, rather than lots of different colors of non-organic bed sheets, I would think less is more, and just kind of focus on, if you can go for quality over quantity, it's going to be healthier, basically, because they are in lots of different parts of our homes. And like Sarah said, think about what's in the garden shed as well. Think about what you use in your own gardens, and as well as in public spaces. I know in America, they some states sell bright yellow pesticide flags that people can put on their front lawns if they have sprayed pesticides on their lawns, for example, so that passers-by don't necessarily walk on their grass or touch it. That's not going to stop dogs and young kids running on it, for example, but at least it is raising a little bit of awareness. And in some places, local authorities in America ask neighbours to give their neighbours 48 hours notice that they're going to be spraying pesticides, so that they can kind of close the windows and avoid that kind of drift in of chemicals into the home. But it also accumulates in house dust as well. So just kind of clearing away any dust that's in the home is like potentially preferably with kind of a damp cloth rather than polish and other sprays, but that kind of thing is a really good thing as well, because otherwise it will accumulate. And like Sarah said, young children on the floor who are kind of playing and putting their hands in their mouths are really vulnerable. So it's just thinking about, it's beyond the fridge, it's beyond the kitchen and beyond the food that we eat. It's in everything that is grown, but also if you live near a rural area, you're likely to have it in the air as well, and we can't control that.
One thing I would add as well, so yeah, obviously, like Anna said, anything that's grown in the soil is likely, if it's not organic, to have been produced with these chemicals. I think in the home as well, I wrote a piece a couple of years ago or last year around fire retardant, and they are literally added to materials. So this is not at the point of it being grown. So you've got a mattress, for example, you've got a cotton covering on a sofa. There is a law in the UK which means that furniture manufacturers have to show fire retardancy. And it's this insane story about how, I don't know, you have to look it up. I've put the article in the chat actually, but basically the way they do that is to spray it with this chemical coating, which, other than the fact doesn't actually protect from fire, it smolders and releases all its chemicals anyway, is made from various chemicals, one of which is an organophosphate, which is a chemical, an agricultural chemical that was banned here. So fire retardancy is one of those weird little things that people don't know a lot about, but is actually a massive source of chemical exposure in the home. So if you're someone who doesn't want to eat your chemicals, and maybe you're in the privileged position where you can make organic food choices, I think that it's worth thinking a little bit about that, because the UK is one of the only countries in the world that allows this to happen. So in the US it started, they kind of realized what was happening, there was a big lobby, they banned it. Here, for some reason, there's a little collected network of vested interests and it's still allowed. So I think that's an area that you might not have thought of, that is a moment of exposure for people. But I thought we'd go back to the point around organic food actually, because a couple of us have suggested that organic is, perhaps the best way to try and reduce your exposure. Obviously that comes with a price tag, a perceived price tag perhaps. Don't know if any of you have any thoughts on that. I mean, are we saying to people you should buy organic? Like, what if you can't afford it? Like, what's the deal there? How can we kind of tackle this idea around inequality, price, exposure to chemicals? If you've got any thoughts on that one, Sarah or Anna, either?
Yeah, it's a really easy one, hey?
Go for it.
I mean, I think, Pan UK's position certainly is that pesticides, let's go back to the basics. Pesticides are toxic chemicals designed to kill and interrupt life systems. And as much as we might try and design them to be used within like a limited or targeted use, they're persistent, they accumulate, they come together in cocktail effects, and they're, broad statement, but largely indicative of an unsustainable agricultural system, or like a disrupted relationship to land, plants, other life forms.
Yeah.
And so, it's, I think Pan UK would say we need to stop using pesticides and transition our use to other ways of using them, like integrated pest management, yes, organic, and think about, look at the whole system. But there is a massive thing there around social justice in terms of what people can afford, and what's accessible. I think it's really hard to say everyone needs to buy all organic, everything, kitchen to bedroom.
Someone's just made a really good point in the chat actually, which you might have some thoughts on, Anna, around the idea of price. And in the UK, I believe we spend quite a small proportion of our income on average on food. And do you think that might be a way of looking at it, perhaps? If you
there's definitely a skewed kind of take on food in this country. I think generally, like, you look at the price of chicken, for example, and you see that straight away. What I would say is, I'm not 100% perfect by any means, and it's about picking your battles and thinking, okay, where are the biggest benefits going to be? So the things that my kids eat the most of in their packed lunches, if I manage to get to the right shops to get organic, I will buy those things that they eat every day organic if possible. I don't buy everything organic because it's not always there, and sometimes I'm in a rush and I just grab what's there. I'm not saying everyone has to be completely perfect, but just think about, are there some easy wins that if you could, the fruit or veg that you buy, that you eat the most of every week, could you switch those and maybe waste less of it? Like, just make sure that you don't throw any away, really kind of make the most of it. And for example, the bedding, like, if you do need a new set of bedding, could you possibly invest in that and make it last a lot longer, rather than having a cupboard full of bed sheets that you're not going to use very often, but that all probably have pesticide residues on them. It's just thinking what is easy for you, what's accessible. Buying secondhand is like, it's cheaper, it's easy, it's better for the environment all round. Buying your clothes secondhand in charity shops, that's a really easy way to cut down loads of different chemicals, as well as like things like leather. You've got all the chromium and things in there, and non-organic cotton will have pesticides on it. So it's more of a mindset shift, I would say, rather than a kind of everybody needs to do this. It's just kind of putting real value on the better options, and supporting local farmers who, they might not be certified organic, but they might be trying to improve like regenerative practices and things like that they are doing their best. And it is a kind of phase of transition that if they have the support from customers, they can then do more. So it's not a kind of case of right or wrong, good or bad. It's kind of looking at how to kind of work towards that more sustainable food system, I suppose, and beyond food as well.
Definitely. I think, it's such a good point. It's such a complex issue, and there's no, we start talking about issues of social inequality, which obviously we can't solve at lunchtime in 45 minutes. So I think it's good to talk about, but I mean, we also need to feel like we can do something, we can feel a bit empowered. So I'll take a few questions from the chat now. This one, Anna, you might be interested in. It's from a journalist. This is from Max Fraser. How can the media raise the profile of these problems? At the moment, it still feels like a very middle-class conversation. So do you have any ideas of ways that stories can kind of, bring some of these things to light?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I try and do in the work that I publish. And it's about storytelling. It's about connecting. It's not about policy. It's not about kind of stats necessarily. It's about telling stories. And that's what I've done in my book. I've gone around my house, I've looked at what's there, I have spoken to scientists all around the world, and I'm joining up the dots between where things are produced, how things are manufactured, how they get to my home, what happens when they're here, but also what happens when they leave as well, and kind of thinking about that whole supply chain. Because actually, as consumers, we only look at a very small snapshot of that big picture, because we're buying something that's useful to us right then. We don't always have time to think about where it's come from and what we're going to do when we chuck it out, or when it washes down the plug hole, for example. And I think it is about connecting those dots and telling those stories, talking to farmers about what they're doing, talking to food producers, bringing those subjects to life. So it's not a really kind of dry theoretical thing, and it becomes really relevant to us. And by telling those stories and showing those solutions, it's a really empowering thing to show that actually we do have a voice as consumers. Like, we might not be able to change the laws and kind of create global regulation instantly, but we can shout about what we want to see more of, and we can support the companies who are doing really ethical, amazing things, and we can support local farmers who are trying their best, and we can spend our money in a positive way, and we can write to our MP, we can write to our retailers, and we can kind of make a bit of a fuss because we care, and showing that we care can then have a knock-on effect back into that supply chain. So actually the media plays an enormous role in terms of kind of highlighting those things. But I would say a lot of the work I do, Max, is solutions focused. So it's very much looking at the progress, the innovation, the change makers who are doing amazing things. So it's not about telling people, no, don't do this, stop doing that. It's about saying, actually, look, there's this amazing alternative over here that no one's noticed yet, and this is really cool, and the solutions already exist. It's not that we have to reinvent everything. It's just we need to shift the emphasis.
That's it, exactly. I think that's a really good point, actually, and someone's put that in the chat around, why can't all food be grown without pesticides?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, a lot of farmers are doing that, and or at least trying to, like that is happening, and it's a positive thought. I think it's not, we're not starting from scratch here. You might think that there's just one way of buying and eating food and living your life, to be a bit grandiose, but there are different things out there, and I think asking questions is a really good place to start, and it doesn't need to be a a provocative thing either. I mean, obviously the media does that anyway, but just as an average person, you can, if you are near a market, you can just have, strike up a conversation with someone who's selling food and ask them where it's from, ask them how it's produced. If you live in a city, maybe not as close to the source, but you could drop a social media post to a supermarket. They read all of them and they all get filtered through. Even better, you could write to your MP, and that takes like 5 minutes, and all you would have to say is, do you know what your area is doing for pesticide reduction? And then the message is received and the little seed is there. So
yeah,
Sarah, have you got any top tips for consumers? What should they do or know that you'd like people to go away with?
Well, I've got a bunch of things to plug, I'm sure.
Well, you've got about 2 minutes, so
no,
go for
it. I mean, you can definitely email through the pesticide ranking on Pan UK's website. You can email the CEOs of all of the top 10 UK supermarkets. On the point about pesticides being used in other places and kind of coming together, there's actually a petition running until the end of January. If we get 100,000 signatures, it triggers a debate in Parliament. I think we're knocking around 40,000, so we definitely need some more.
We put that in the chat as well. We could.
Yeah, that is that's looking at phasing out and banning urban use, like local authority use pesticides, and amateur use. So why do we all need to be spraying all these pesticides in our gardens and things? Yeah, I mean, pulling back on some of the earlier conversation around buying organic and consumer choices. Again, that's why the Dirty Dozen list is quite useful. It can help you prioritize what you might want to buy organic if you can't afford to buy everything organic, or thinking about what has the most residues or cocktails of pesticides on there. And then, in terms of the pesticide collaboration, we're just really interested in pushing the UK government to have tighter regulations and support farmers to make that transition to reduce pesticide use. It's a collaboration full of different organisations, academics, a lot of nature-friendly farmers in there. I'm always up for hearing more people who want to join and kind of protect the regulation that we currently have, but then also really pressure government, try and shift public opinion. It's 60th anniversary of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring this year, since it was published. And it's a time to, I guess, take stock about the bell that she alarmed all those years ago and how it still resonates and is still really important. We've still got some ways to go, but
I think that's a really good point. And we focused a lot on the effect on humans and our kind of link our bodies but obviously, like you say, the natural world is in crisis, and a lot of that is driven by industrial farming, agri-chemicals. Obviously you've got other things, habitat decline, but it's so important to remember the bigger picture, and it's really important to think of the effect on us. But this is one of the areas. I feel like agri-chemical companies are like the fossil fuel companies, but for nature.
Totally. Yeah.
And there is not enough focus on them. They just sit there in the shadows selling in all these chemicals to farmers, so they're locked in and it ends up in our bodies. And I feel like there should be a bit more anger about that, perhaps. But to end on a positive note, obviously Sarah said, like, the Pan UK is a brilliant and organisation for all the information you need, and the pesticide collaboration is a brilliant community which you can be part of and inform yourself and find like-minded people. And both speakers are obviously available to be contacted directly if you want to continue the conversation. I know we haven't quite got through all the questions, but if you go to the Hoover online platform, you can find the speakers, contact them directly, contact each other, keep the conversation going. And we'll leave it there 1 minute before the end, and hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference. And thanks for coming to our session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks all.
Bye.